How's it going, guys? I'm finally back to doing movie reviews. I just really wanted to talk about Dunkirk. I went into Dunkirk with, I don't know, I went in with semi high expectations. I didn't know very much about the movie, other than, it's Christopher Nolan. But I went in more excited to see it than Valerian, which I haven't seen yet, because I think that I'll hate Valerian for sure. I went into Dunkirk, I was expecting a Christopher Nolan movie, maybe like an overhyped World War II movie, but either way, it seemed pretty good. No one tells you this going in exactly, but it follows the three different people in evacuation of this city in Belgium, I think. It just drops you into a war zone, which is very intense. Sure is a spectacle. Now let's go over some of the positive things about this movie, because it's very interesting. First positive, it's very experimental. With Christopher Nolan, you can never expect exactly what you're going to get out of a movie other than a Christopher Nolan movie. So it does experiment a lot with some interesting ideas, a lot of hopping around in time, a lot of out of order storytelling, which has been done before, but this is a very interesting way of doing it. You sort of understand that there's going to be some time hopping once you get into it. Outside of that, there's some good acting. I went in expecting a lot of over-the-top, give-me-Oscar acting, but it's very much the director's movie. It's very much Christopher Nolan's movie. It's not commandeered by any one of the actors. They're all pretty good, but there's definitely no standout actor in the sense that Hacksaw Ridge has Andrew Garfield sticking out, or a film like that. The ensemble was a pretty interesting idea, and a lot of what's done with the extras is really smart and really creative. A lot of the shots that are swarming with extras are really breathtaking and very epic, of like a grand proportion. You go in thinking, oh, a Christopher Nolan movie that's swarming with an army of extras, and you're like, well, that's gotta be something pretty cool. A lot of the sound editing is really interesting, in that there's good parts to it and there's bad parts to it. We'll get to the bad parts later, but for the good parts, a lot of times in these gigantic action movies, the explosions and the gunshots and the massive scales of destruction are sort of lost on you as you're watching a massive war movie. But this movie, Dunkirk, keeps you in it, right? It's constantly on edge. You're constantly, every bullet is loud, every surprise gunshot is startling. Every time something happens with a boat, or every time something happens with an explosive, you're like, whoa. Bleh. The whole movie is very loud. It had a very good use of most of its dialogue. A lot of the times, a lot was conveyed, and throughout most of the movie, dialogue wasn't really necessary, especially considering how it focuses on you being in the middle of this gigantic war. A lot of what you see is you see a lot of stares, you see a lot of shocked extras, you see a lot of shocked actors, you see a lot of, peril, and there's not much to say during those times until after it's over or before it begins. Everything with it that was necessary, like effects and, all that, was pretty well done. A lot of it you could sort of tell wasn't necessary. A lot of the stuff that was happening was stuff where, it would just set actors in the motion. I think the only real time that any effects were used was in, plane fighting scenes and, ships going down, or stuff being blown up. And most of the time, I didn't even consider it when I was in the movie. A lot of it looks really good. It just sort of puts you there, and you sort of forget that what's going on is effects. So that was pretty well done. The soundtrack was a Hans Zimmer soundtrack, so of course it's going to be pretty solid. It was really enjoyable, but similar to the sound editing, it is sort of off sometimes, and I'll explain why. I'm going to move into some of my cons about the film. I don't have a lot, but I've got some nitpicky stuff that I felt was very annoying while I was watching the film, and were the only things keeping me from being totally engrossed in the movie. Like I said earlier, there was some good and some bad to the sound editing and the music. That problem was that it constantly overshadowed the dialogue. Whenever it's playing loud music over important discussion, or two characters are talking, it becomes very distracting. Oftentimes I saw myself fantasizing scenes from this movie, just watching them in the theater, and it became very apparent that something was wrong with how overbearing a lot of the soundtrack was.
What?
So, as the movie went on, it became very distracting. Although it was very poetic whenever stuff was blowing up and, people were dying, it quickly became very annoying during small times of dialogue. Another thing that really bothered me about the soundtrack was that it seemed, I think, that they were trying to make the soundtrack play constantly throughout the movie. I think that it was just from beginning to end. I mean, I believe it starts with silence, but after that, pretty much through the entire movie, I believe there were 3 breaks of silence, and they were only like minimal to send like a punch. And while that punch was really well, it didn't help speaking scenes in the middle of the movie. A lot of the times I couldn't understand what characters were saying, and I'm not sure if that was a problem with my hearing or if that was a problem with the surround sound at the theater I was at. But either way, it was very annoying, and I'd just rather it be silent during scenes where silence is obviously kind of wanted. You can even tell that they were having trouble shoehorning in the soundtrack sometimes because of how little the soundtrack would play during those scenes. There would be a constant beep, like a bee while they were talking, or there would be a ticking. And I understand that this is probably like a metaphor for their constant, the fact that they're constantly anxious and they're constantly on edge while trying to be evacuated from Dunkirk. But that doesn't change the fact that for me as a viewer, it becomes very quickly super distracting and kind of unnecessary. Another problem that I had was with the pacing. I feel like Christopher Nolan obviously tells his stories out of order a lot. I really enjoyed that in The Prestige and some of his other films, but I don't think that... I think it worked well to an extent here, but a lot of the time the hopping around made me very anxious, and I sort of started to lose track of where I was in the film. This film doesn't necessarily have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's sort of just like, you're in war, go. And I understand that in its own is very experimental, but I don't think that it worked entirely in his favor. Now, a lot of other people might be more forgiving of this than I am, but personally, I found it pretty distracting, and it made a lot of the scenes slower, hopping between a awesome plane gunfight and then hopping back into reality where they're just sitting still and talking and being sad and depressed, and then cutting back to the plane fight scene. It's just kind of too much. Overall, Dunkirk's been a pretty great movie. I thought it was very enjoyable. It had very good acting. It was a spectacle. It was very gorgeously shot, and I think that whenever it comes down to stuff like the sound editing and the pacing, it was distracting, but overall it didn't detract too much from the movie. So it was just a little bit upsetting. It might be more of a pick, but overall, if I had to give this movie a score, it would be an 8 out of 10, a solid B for Dunkirk. Very well done, very solid, agreeably good, and I think you should definitely go out and watch it if you have the chance. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.